Welcome back to Wired for Change, where we dive into the strategies, mindsets, and stories behind meaningful transformation. I'm your host, Amy Yee. Today, we're so fortunate to have with us Radhika Dutt, whose work has helped organizations from startups to national regulators with their work in terms of leading, building, and measuring meaningful change themselves. Radhika Dutt is the author of Radical Product Thinking, a framework that's resonated globally for its bold yet practical challenge to how we innovate. What a challenge that is, and something that so many people are thinking about right now. But she hasn't stopped there. Right now, she's thinking about taking aim at something that many of us take for granted, the idea of goal setting itself. In a world that's obsessed with OKRs and performance measurement, Radhika is offering a different path, one that prioritizes vision, learning, and curiosity as drivers of meaningful results. If you've ever felt a little bit uneasy about the goals that you set within a project, maybe even a little sick to your stomach, knowing that people will see it, knowing that people will get married to those goals, and knowing the feeling afterwards where you're not sure how to start a conversation about whether or not those are the right goals. Will that harm your credibility? What will the team think about that project and those goals once you've revisited those goals? Will they see it as a failure? This episode is going to be interesting to you if you've ever felt that way. Radhika, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here, Amy. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Excellent. Radhika, you wrote Radical Product Thinking, the new mindset for innovating smarter, as we just said. And it's a methodology to help product teams build and think differently. How is it that you got there? What made you write this book?
Let's say it was a series of hard lessons. Isn't that always what prompts change?
It is. It is.
um, so my background is that I studied engineering. I did undergrad and grad at MIT. My first startup was one that we founded right in our dorm rooms, and it was called Lobby 7. And our vision, by the way, was to revolutionize wireless, which I still don't know what exactly it meant 25 years later. And so, in hindsight, what we had really caught was the disease I now call hero syndrome, because we were all about being big, scaling. We were about getting all these big logo clients. But if you ask me, really, what is the problem that we were setting out to solve? We didn't really know. Right. So that was the first hard lesson, that you really needed clarity in terms of what's the change you're trying to bring about. Only then can you build a product. But that was, in my early 20s. But what happened after that was I worked in a series of companies in many different industries. And along the way, I kept finding that there's the same set of product diseases I was running into. And I'll call these product diseases out. Just one example is obsessive sales disorder. There's pivotitis. There's also strategic swelling. All
Strategic
of these
swelling.
start.
It's very visual.
Right? And, for a long time, I kept thinking, is it that we're just doomed to learning from these hard lessons, catching diseases, and then building an intuition over time as you build experience on how to avoid those problems, right? But then my problem was, as I was growing in my career, I then knew how to avoid those diseases, but often I had to watch others go through the same thing. And so the burning question for me was, is it that we're all doomed to learning from such failure, or is there a systematic and clear process that we can give people so that people can be vision driven as opposed to iteration led? And what I mean by iteration led is, let's throw things at the wall and see what sticks, the kind of Silicon Valley approach. We've often heard of it as, to innovate well, you just have to keep iterating. Like all these mantras that I realized that we needed to question so that we could avoid those product diseases and still build transformative products. And that's what led me to radical product thinking.
Amazing. And could you tell me a little bit more about the strategic swelling disease?
I'll I'll talk about a couple of them because
Please.
they're because I've run into them myself or caught them, right? So strategic swelling is what happens when your product starts out well, and then your customers say, "Ooh, if you just add this one other feature, I could also use your product to do blah." And you
Ah,
think that's a brilliant idea. So you add that. And then another customer has another such idea. And then you keep expanding your product, right? And now it's doing everything for everyone. And it's so bloated that you barely recognize
hmm. Wow. That's a good one. I like
it.
that.
Yeah. Another one that I kept running across is pivotitis.
Mhm.
So I was VP of marketing at a startup. And, we were going to be the next Visa of the world. But we realized that, that's really hard to do because that requires acquiring consumers and merchants. And so we said, okay, we're going to pivot. We decided to become a credit solutions company for merchants. But along the way, we also tried out other things like, oh, we should try being a loyalty solutions provider for merchants. And we decided, oh, no, 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 a month later, that was just way too crowded of a market. But, we went through so many such pivots that at some point, as head of marketing, I had no idea what I was asking people to sign up for on the website, right?
Mhm.
So that's pivotitis, where we think we should just keep pivoting until we get to product market fit. But the reality in any company, regardless of how much budget you have 2 to 3 pivots before you run out of either money or momentum.
Interesting. And so how do you balance kind of being able to pivot and not being afraid to pivot when you need to versus over pivoting too many times? Or that idea of, the strategic swelling when a customer asks you for something. I mean, often it's quite a good idea because you'll make more money or you'll pay, they'll pay for it. And it's great. But then how do you balance that with, knowing when to stop or knowing when you've fallen off of the vision track and maybe it's not a good idea for the future? Because there are so many success stories that actually, are based on pivoting or based on, adding that customer feature.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not that pivoting by itself is bad. We just have to pivot with gravitas. And what do I mean by that, right? And this is what radical product thinking is about. It's about how you can create change very systematically. And it means starting with a very clear vision. So, what I mean by a clear vision
Mhm.
is most companies today, they have visions like what we did about revolutionizing wireless. Boeing's vision is what to be the enduring global champion of aerospace or something like that, and Snapchat's vision is something like contributing to human progress by empowering people to express themselves, right? These visions sound grand, but they don't tell the team what to do. It's
Mhm.
like telling your construction team, build me the biggest, baddest house, and they're at a loss for what do I actually do, right? So in the radical product thinking book, I talk about what is a good vision. And I offer a fill in the blank statement so that you're not just stuck on wordsmithing, so that you're really focusing on the content, like what you want to say. So here is a radical vision statement for a B2B company
Mhm.
that I was working at. And I'm not going to tell you anything about the company. I'll just tell you the vision and you'll know what it is. Let's see if this works, right?
Okay.
Okay. So today, when TV ad sales teams want to create quotes for TV ads, they have to dig into a ton of different data sets to find audience segments, what those audience segments are watching, etc. And it takes a long time to create quotes. This is unacceptable because this means we're just falling behind in TV advertising. That TV advertising is going to die out compared to digital advertising, where everything happens automatically. We envision a world where offering TV advertising quotes is much easier, transparent. You have a clear sense of exactly which audiences can be accessed and how, and design your campaigns. We're bringing about this world through our product, which is going to give you this curation of various data sets, all accessible from a single platform, and the ability to query these data sets without having to be an engineer running SQL queries, just by doing drag and drop and clicking and or. So that's the product. That was the
That
vision.
was that whole thing was
Hopefully
the
you
vision?
knew. That was the vision.
Okay.
But see, it sounds like an essay,
Yes.
but um, this is exactly the clarity that one
Wow.
needs. I had so much clarity with my team on the vision. We never needed a short slogan. It didn't have to be memorable, etc. Right? Everyone could describe the same vision in their words. I didn't need them to repeat the vision in my words.
Mhm.
And that's the power of it. So this is just one tiny piece of radical product thinking. And there are other such elements. There's the vision, strategy, prioritization, execution and measurement, and culture. And each such element offers simple frameworks, but that helps you very systematically translate vision into everyday action.
Hmm. Very interesting.
So going back to the question on pivotitis and how do you avoid it? What I mean by pivoting with gravitas is that you just have to have such a detailed vision so that if you pivot, you're able to point to your vision and say exactly what you learned. So, what was wrong in this vision? And then what you're going to change next,
Mm.
right? What happens with pivotitis is it feels more like whiplash. Today we're doing this, tomorrow we're doing that, but we never go back to pointing to the vision. You lose momentum when it feels like whiplash, right? When the team feels like you don't know what you're doing, as opposed to being able to point to a vision and say, this is what we learned, what we got wrong, and here's what's next. It feels like progress.
Mhm. Interesting. I like how, you've given us a sense of, what that feels like. And do you, just before we move to goal setting, I wanted to ask you, do you have recommendations for, what to do when, maybe a few members of your team are feeling that whiplash? And I know this is just one of the diseases you talk about, but what is the guidance, for, raising your hand perhaps, or for looking at, what to do or understanding how to talk to your leader or the rest of your team about it? To take action.
Oh, such a great question. And, from our transformation backgrounds,
Mhm.
like one thing I have thought about for teams is how do you introduce this approach without directly being this bull in a china shop and saying, guys, our vision sucks. We've got to start over with a
Exactly.
vision statement because you can't often do that,
That's
right?
right.
Um, and so, my approach to how to introduce this sort of under the radar is I don't introduce it from the vision perspective. I introduce it in sort of everyday decision making. So, what I do is, okay, as a leader, what you're usually doing, or even as an individual contributor, whatever you're doing, if you're a college student, you're constantly balancing the long term against the short term,
Mhm.
right? This yin and yang of long term versus short term. And so, if you just plot long term versus short term, you can start to visualize decisions. So the long term is your y axis of is this a good vision fit or not? And now, as an individual contributor, even just take a moment to write down this detailed vision statement that you have for your product, right? And then you can start to look at decisions and say, is this good for the vision or not?
Mhm.
And your x axis is this good for survival or not in the short term? And what you discover when you draw this for yourself is things that are good for the vision and survival. Those are often the easy decisions, right? Where we often hang about in the easy decision category.
Mhm.
Um, then there are the harder decisions, which is where, for example, it's good for vision, but in the short term, it's not great for survival. So, examples of this would be where you're investing in the vision. That's the quadrant name. You're investing in the vision if you're, for example, fixing tech debt, you're spending some time on learning and development. All of those are investing in the vision. And the opposite of that, right, is vision debt, which is where you do things that are good for short term. For example, you take on a custom deal that's going to win you this mega client. That was vision debt because it's great for survival, but hey, that custom feature wasn't good for the long term vision. And so what I do is introduce this two by two. And in a meeting where we're talking about a decision, I make it less personal by plotting the decision on this two by two. And I might explain why the sales deal feels like it's going to add a lot of vision debt. And in the end, we might choose to do it anyway, but at least everyone has acknowledged that yes, it's vision debt, but hey, we need to survive. We need to do this. Okay. But next time I can bring this up again and show, hey, when do we invest in the vision? Right. And so the moment you introduce this two by two, you start to take on a more facilitative approach, which in transformation is super helpful because you're bringing about the right discussion. And then not only are you bringing about this discussion, but you're also sort of pushing things towards what you want, but you're creating a common vocabulary and you're very subtly bringing about this question. Well, how do you define the vision? I wonder. And that's your chance to say, aha, I thought you'd never ask. But here's my take. What do you think? Are we in alignment there?
Wow.
What do you think?
That's so great, Radhika. If I could glow, I would be glowing right now because I'm talking to another engineer who thinks in terms of two by twos. And also, it's so powerful, that idea of being able to point something visually to something visually and have a conversation about something that has become less personal because you've created this framework where you can plot things and have conversations about them and understand where different people are coming from in terms of, is this okay? Or is it not? And where are we really? And it really makes the whole conversation safer, and helps it to take shape and direction, and for it to become a practice. So really enjoyed that approach, Radhika. Thanks so much for sharing that. Love it. So tell me a little bit now about how you got to sort of this place where you're thinking about goal setting. That it seems like a pretty strong path, I think, because you've gone from vision and then now clearly in terms of execution, how are you going to execute on things? And so, what are your thoughts on goal setting? What was that? What's that journey for you?
So, it's been fascinating actually that some of the comments were after I wrote Radical Product Thinking and people adopting this approach, that I realized I also needed to tackle goal setting. Because people would say, in my company, I totally see what you're saying about this vision versus survival. I want us to invest in the vision, but what do I do when we have all these OKRs? And it's really driving me towards the short term stuff. Because if you think about it, and now that you have this two by two as a framework for plotting things, right? You start to see that when you have OKRs, a lot of the stuff in OKRs ends up being great for short-term survival, right? Like it pushes you towards that short term.
Mhm.
And no matter, even if you say that this is a long-term OKR, I'm setting a 5-year goal or a 3-year goal, whatever it is, the reality is when you set, let's say it's even a goal for, growing a market to X million in the next 3 years. So you think it's a long-term goal, but how are you actually going to get there? That's the piece you don't know. Maybe it's going to add a ton of custom work, and that's how your people are achieving those targets. And without you realizing it, you've created vision debt in so many ways because we're still hitting those targets, thinking about it in this short term way, right? And so what I realized was a lot of people were saying, I want to take this approach. I want to be more vision driven, but my company is pushing me towards short term stuff. We're all focused on goals and targets. What do I do in my company? Um, and so one thing, it really triggered in me that for many, many, many years, I'd been seeing a side effect that was coming from this whole goal setting approach.
Mhm.
And regardless of what you called the methodology, whether you call it OKRs, KPIs, SMART goals, whatever you want, I was seeing the same set of effects. And I couldn't at the time articulate what the issues were, but something wasn't sitting right by me. And, as I finally started to do more research, I realized that there's actually a pattern and there's very clear research
Mhm.
that shows the downsides of goals and goal setting. And then, what I tried as a next approach was telling leaders, hey, how about we don't do goal setting? Here are the issues with goal setting. And the reaction I was getting was, well, but that's the devil I know. What are you proposing instead? And so it wasn't until about a year ago when I could really try out a different approach that I was seeing that this works. That's when I decided, okay, I have to write this next book.
Mhm. Wow, amazing. Okay, good. And so when is this next book coming out, by the way?
I'm still in the writing
Mhm.
process, so it's going to be about a year from now. So, in fact, this is a sneak preview for our listeners that what I'm sharing is a whole methodology. And in fact, this is an opportunity where I'm sharing it early enough where if you end up using this, you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn. And if you share your story, I might use it as a case study in the book. So you're welcome to reach out as you find what your experiences are with it.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Good. So maybe you could share, just a concrete example of taking us through sort of get to an organization. How do you even know that like the goals are offside? Like, is there other than somebody telling you? Like, is there a way to sort of tell, or are there indicators for you that show that maybe the goals aren't sort of matching what it is that they want to do, and they may need to take a different approach?
That is such an interesting question, right? And I do want to share an example. But one thing I'll start off with is that as a leader, when you have people showing you that they've hit goals, the whole purpose of them showing you, I mean, it's with the incentive that they want to show you what numbers you've set for them. So the incentive is I'm going to say, ta da, I've hit whatever numbers you've
Hmm.
set for me. And all the bad metrics, quote unquote, I have just learned to sweep them under the rug because I don't want to show you that this and this and this has not worked because I don't want to look like a bad performer. What's my incentive? To show you all those bad things, right?
It's true.
Um, so let's talk about concrete examples, though, in terms of the kind of behavior that I've seen. The first thing that I see is sandbagging, right? Which is, and there's a cultural aspect to this too. But sandbagging, like you really don't want to set goals in such a way that you're setting yourself or your team up for failure.
Hmm.
So, depending on your organizational culture, people might, in fact, be very hesitant to set anything too aspirational, also because of culture. Like I was talking to a colleague of mine in Japan, and she was saying, well, in our company you never set a goal that you cannot hit. I mean, why would you do that? You don't want to fail. um, so that is one effect. The second is I often have teams telling me, how do we frame these metrics for management? Like what I've seen is every month when there's the monthly business review, in the week or two before that, there's the scramble to say, oh, what numbers can we present? And quickly, how do we massage these numbers so that they look good?
Well, it is true, and sometimes there's a very valid sort of understanding gap between the people that they're presenting to and the team. And so, if you've only got 45 minutes with that executive team, how do you frame it in a way that they'll understand and you'll have like the desired consequence? Because often their understanding is just so completely different from yours. Even if you were completely transparent, sometimes it just isn't going to make any sense to them. That's very interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, having been in those shoes, it's not that you have any ill
No.
motivations. It's just that you need to convey this. And you're so steeped in all of this, you might even know exactly what it is. But this is sort of, but you don't get it across. So you have to spin it in exactly the right way to say, this is my message, right?
Mhm.
But as a leader, if I just knew the story a little bit better, I might have said something differently.
Yes.
Or I needed to know this plus some other bad metrics, and I would then suggest a different course.
Exactly. Exactly. It's tough.
And then one more effect is that I've often seen product managers say to me, well, OKRs gave me a lot of clarity. I actually told my team if it's not moving in OKR, don't do it.
Mhm.
That's also bad, right? Because then you're missing out on so many innovation opportunities just because that didn't lead to a particular OKR moving.
It's true, and as a
Um,
leader, you might think that, well, this is helping them to prioritize, right? Maybe your team is burning out, right? They need to prioritize, so you're helping them by giving them clarity in terms of what to focus on, but you don't know whether or not that's going to help the overall vision. Mhm.
exactly, exactly. And so these were just a few symptoms that I was seeing, right?
Mhm.
But I think the one common thread that I see is the muscle of experimentation, learning, adaptation, that puzzle solving muscle, I'll say, was atrophying. And instead, the performance theater that hitting goals was creating, where you're either wantonly spinning numbers, or feeling like others are spinning numbers, whereas you're trying to honestly present something, right? Like all of that sort of performance theater really just kills things for you. So as a high performer, like what you really want is, instead of performance theater, puzzle setting and puzzle solving is your catnip.
Nice.
Um, and so the approach that I advocate for is, instead of setting goals as a leader, um, it doesn't mean, by the way, that you don't set expectations of what you want. I'll get to that in a moment.
Okay.
But more than sort of this top down, here are goals and here are the numbers I'm going to measure you against, it's more of puzzle setting and puzzle solving and creating scaffolding for all of this, so that you really build that innovation muscle within the organization and make those high performers thrive.
Walk us through that idea of puzzle setting, because when you first explained that to me on our earlier call, I fell in love with it. And so let's lean into that a little bit more so that people know what you mean by puzzle setting.
Yeah. So let's talk about a real example, right? And let's take the hardest example, which is sales. We've always learned that targets is how you do sales. And so an OKR for sales might look like, objective, grow the business. Key result is hit X million ARR, or revenues, by the end of this year. Instead, here's a puzzle setting approach. As a leader, I would say, this is the revenue I'm expecting by the end of this year. But I've seen that our growth trajectory was looking like this. We were growing over the last 3 years, but now it's sort of plateaued in this last year. What is going on? How might we solve this puzzle so that we can get back to that growth trajectory and hit X million in revenue? So this is the puzzle. And I might have some guiding questions, things that I honestly don't know the answer to. And those might be things like, has the market changed? Is our competition doing something that we've fallen behind on? It might be, is there something different within our sales team at this point? Has there been, like, perhaps there's been a leadership shift, or the way we were approaching the market was that we had really won the early adopters, but now we've stalled because we haven't adopted how we're selling into the mass market. There may be a bunch of questions I honestly don't know the answer to. And this is where you invite your team to set this puzzle together with you. So I'll pause there for a moment and then we'll talk about puzzle solving.
I really like that because, and sales is such a great example of that. And there are other examples, but I've been there in terms of feeling like, well, we know this and we know that and we have this information, but we don't know what's going to happen if we do these things, or is it something else? Like, why aren't people buying? Or, who wants to buy? And it's a series of questions, and it is a puzzle, but I've never thought about it as a puzzle to be solved. And I do like puzzles. But I've never taken that approach to think, well, let's solve this as a puzzle, and spoken to my teammates about, well, how do we solve this puzzle? Because often we also get kind of locked into our own individual kind of mindsets and silos and try to solve the puzzle from our own kind of place and our own perspective. But we're not really asking other people to join us in solving that puzzle either. So I really like this idea of framing it as a puzzle.
I love it. And, framing it as a puzzle also invites um, thinking about what else is going on. What other numbers should be looking at? One article I'd read on HBR that I really liked was about Walmart, and then CEO of Walmart US, Greg Foran. He was mentioning how profits hide a lot of sins that you might
That's
that
true.
you might hit, right? That you might hit all sorts of numbers, but it's hiding what's actually happening underneath, that it might not be a healthy business. And he was saying how, they were hitting all the right numbers, but actually, the engagement of Walmart staff wasn't where it needed to be. The ratings of various stores wasn't where they needed it to be, et cetera, et cetera. There was a long list. And so there's another friend of mine who says, it takes 2 years for a whale to sink when it dies. So sometimes, it's that you might have great numbers, you might be hitting sales targets, but it's just taking a long time for this whale to sink to the ocean floor.
So true.
Uh, And so that's why you want puzzle settings, so that you really want people to pick away at it, right? And if it's going to sink to the floor, let it do so really quickly, and you have to figure out what are you going to do instead, right? And so let's go
No,
on.
I was thinking it kind of through in terms of how would I tell my board? Like, because boards are often they're interested in sort of the results, like the revenues, are they okay? The risks, like what do we have in terms of risks? They're not, I don't think that they're thinking in terms of puzzles. And so not that that would be a bad thing, but that whole idea of the whale taking 2 years to sink, I think is a very interesting one in terms of how you carry that conversation through kind of an organization and take action around it. So that's just what I was thinking of. But I think this is great.
It's such an interesting point, right? And I've thought about this too. And I was talking to someone. It's the person who is heading up marketing at a company called ITX, Kyle.
Mm.
He was saying that with their board, they actually do this workshopping approach where instead of just presenting numbers as, here are our targets, here's what we're going to do this year, etc., they often talk about puzzles that they need to address during the year. That,
Mm.
here are some challenges in the market, in the business, whatever it is. And they actually workshop these ideas with the board. Right?
Amazing.
And I think it's a fascinating approach. I don't think we sort of really consider such a radical rethink of how a board meeting could go.
I love it. It really gets everyone kind of on the same side. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I love the idea too. And, it's one of those things where board members, I mean, let's face it, we all want to feel like we're adding value by contributing ideas. And a lot of how they're currently encouraged to contribute ideas is to look at numbers and then comment on what you need to do differently. Well, what if we could reframe how you get to contribute those ideas and it's through workshopping and puzzle solving instead? And that could be, something it certainly works for
Mhm.
ITX, but it's made me realize, like, I think it's something that we can apply more broadly.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. I'm gonna remember that one for sure.
And it's made me think about it as a way of getting leaders on board, that even as an individual contributor, sometimes instead of just presenting numbers, you could also make it a puzzle solving thing. You have to use this very carefully, of course.
This is gonna be a good experiment. Now, talking about leaders, since we're, on that subject, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that leaders have about goals and goal setting, do you think, that you've seen?
Yeah, the biggest misconception is that goals are what we need to motivate people. That if we didn't have goals, my team wouldn't be motivated. Right? And what I think is
Hmm.
fascinating is just, like you were saying earlier, you said, oh, I love solving puzzles. I mean, that's the thing with smart people, like we like puzzles. Like imagine I ask you, well, Amy, what goals would you like to set for this year for yourself?
I know, it's always like
Versus, exactly. Oh, God, I would hate that
I
question
really
when I was
do.
being asked that. And instead, you ask me the question, well, what puzzles would you like to be solving this year? Right. And I can give you all the puzzles I genuinely can think of in terms of our business and what I think we need to figure out that I don't know the answers to. There's a long list, right? It changes kind of it changes our mindset and how we go about it. So I think that is sort of the biggest I don't know, rethinking or mindset shift for leaders to consider that people have internal motivation and setting goals is an external driver that maybe you don't always need, right? That sometimes what you need is how do you spark that internal motivation even more? And the second piece to it, by the way, which is an adjacent element,
Mhm.
is this focus on performance evaluation as opposed to performance development.
Right. Yeah.
So I'll tell you
Mhm.
about this one manager I was talking with just last week. She was saying to me, I love this puzzle setting and puzzle solving. I'm doing that with my new hire. But how do I evaluate him?
Mhm.
Like, what are the criteria that I should give him rankings for?
Yes.
And I was, and the thing is, how do you measure good performance? Like, if you think back to where the idea of goals and OKRs came from, it goes back to the 1940s idea of Peter Drucker,
Mhm.
where he came up with management by objectives working at General Motors, where with a workforce at the time that was primarily working on assembly lines, unskilled labor, where you didn't have automation, it was repetitive tasks. And you could tell Andy is a better performer than Bob because he installed 45 tires and Bob did 40. Easy to measure. And you go like, okay, this is how I'm going to compensate you. And then you apply the same logic to, let's say, measuring researchers by the number of papers that they've written, right? And this is where you get crappy papers, you get falsified data,
Yes.
and you get a toxic work culture where everyone is trying to usurp their underlings' work, right? Um, and so, what is good performance? What research actually shows is instead of constantly making people feel evaluated, if you truly want your feedback to land, you want to give feedback, but not make it feel like an evaluation, right?
Mhm.
So if, we can make people feel like, here's what you're doing really well. Here's what I really want you to get better. And here's why I know you can do it. And then I see how you're doing this puzzle solving. I see your depth of thinking. And we'll talk about puzzle solving in a moment, because I think that's a
Yes.
really important part of always knowing exactly where someone is at and how their performance actually is and what I want them to improve, etc. That's the piece that gives me all the clues I need. And then the rest of it is about giving them feedback and seeing improvement. And honestly, if I'm not seeing that improvement, maybe the conversation at the end of the year is, listen, I'm not seeing this improvement. And they're probably going to agree as well. And it doesn't mean you're not weeding out bad performance. But by constantly just doing numbers and rankings, the conversation just comes to, if you give me feedback, I'm going to be like, well, that's not really fair because I know you're evaluating me. On that particular day when that happened and the feedback you're giving me, well, these were the other circumstances. You're just not aware of those circumstances. All those conversations we have with, as managers with our employees, where there's all this justification, we get rid of all of that, where feedback is more open, where you're welcoming it with just more receptivity because we're all on the same side.
Hmm. And so, I guess practically speaking, when you are trying to measure someone and you're taking into account kind of their puzzle solving kind of abilities, how would that feel, as a leader? Like, would you be looking for evidence that they're solving the puzzle? Would you still have some goals that they're still being measured, against? Like, how do you prepare for that evaluation of your employees so that you're setting this up for success?
Yeah, so let's talk about puzzle solving
Hmm.
first and what that entails. And then let's come back to this
Sounds
question. I
good.
really do want to come back to it. So, puzzle solving, right? Because we talked about puzzle setting so far. Puzzle solving involves asking three questions. And by the way, there's a free template for this
Oh,
that I have, and I can share with you a link afterwards.
excellent.
And it's conveniently in a Google Slides format, so you can just start to use this.
Beautiful.
So the puzzle solving template is about three questions. The first question is, how well did it work? And that means you have to define what how well and did it work actually means. That requires defining the hypothesis.
Hmm.
So if I try this experiment, then this is what I'm expecting because this is the connection between what I expect and the experiment that I'm running, right? And then I would have leading and lagging indicators so that I can test whether this hypothesis is working. And asking the question in that format, how well is it working? It's not this binary judgment already. It's not a binary judgment of have you or haven't you achieved a goal. I really want to hear both the good and the bad of what is working, what is not. What have you figured out? The second question is, what have you learned? And this is where I say to teams, don't just give me a bunch of numbers. Don't just tell me here's the weekly number of active users, time spent in site, bounce rate, blah, blah, blah. You know, Instead of just quoting me all those numbers, tell me the story, the narrative of what you've figured out. What have you, if you had played detective on all of these numbers and you figured out this puzzle in terms of what is happening today, describe that story for me. And then the third question is what will you try next? So based on how well it's working and what you've learned, if I were to give you a magic wand, what is that one thing you would ask for? And so the last two questions, they trigger creative thinking.
Mhm.
What have you learned and what have you asked? Oh, and what will you ask for? And then the first question is what triggers the left brain thinking, where it's analytical, right? And so when I am working with a team, I can see very quickly, based on the depth of their analysis of these three questions, who is actually solving the puzzle versus who's pretending, right? Because when they show what have you learned, and what are you going to do next? Like I can really understand the depth of that learning when I ask questions, right? There's very little bullshitting that can happen
Mhm.
once you start to expect depth. And that's where you can tell who's a good performer or not. There were people who were hired from Google and Amazon and in this company, and the expectation was these are people who are so data driven, blah, blah, they'll know how to optimize for these numbers. But I wasn't seeing the depth of that thinking. They were optimizing numbers without that depth of how well is it working? What have we learned? That what have we learned is what I really care about. So to come back to the evaluation
Mhm.
part, if I know that your learnings are so important that that's going to fundamentally shift what we're doing, and we've been on the wrong track all along, the fact that we shifted it and we haven't yet achieved that goal, I'm not going to hold that against you, right? But it gives me what a sense of depth you've created in our learning, our ability to do better. On the other hand, when I'm not seeing that, even if you present good enough numbers, etc., and there's incremental change, is that really great performance? So that's, I think, the point as we evaluate people, the open feedback that we're able to share. And getting people to improve performance and then continuing to give them bigger puzzles to solve and seeing how they do with it, right? Isn't that the whole point of performance and development? Like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I haven't spent as much time thinking about it as you, Radhika, but I do think that this makes for a really good culture. Actually, the way that you describe it, if these are the kinds of conversations you're having with your team, and the kinds of conversations that they're having together, it sounds like a very fun place to work and a very kind of safe place to work, and one where people are being, very collaborative and forthcoming, and really using the critical thinking skills and the experience that they have, not just sort of in that moment, but thinking through things that they might have solved in the past in terms of puzzles, as well, and asking questions. It's more of a question driven kind of environment and one of curiosity, which, takes me to, my next question around, you talk about, I think, nurturing curiosity as an important point of this whole process of innovation, and what does that look like, within a team to you? And I think this is part of that. How else do you see curiosity playing a role with everything that you've framed here, from vision all the way to execution and performance measurement and the achievement of that vision?
Such a series of insightful points. I want to unpack a couple of those. First thing that you were talking about was the psychological safety, and then I also want to get to
Hmm.
curiosity and the part it plays. But the point about psychological safety as a leader, if you're able to create such a setting within your team, even if you don't necessarily have the same level of psychological safety in the rest of the organization, just irrespective of where you're at in this organization, you can create this bubble of, deep thinking and interesting conversations, being able to solve puzzles together. You can create catnip for, your own bubble of people, right? And that has been my experience, that I was working with an organization where this particular team that I was working with, they instituted OKRs. There wasn't necessarily psychological safety in the rest of the organizations, but by God, we were enjoying working together just because we could have such conversations,
Yes.
right? So that was the first thing, like just the curiosity, being able to puzzle solve together, uh, just made a huge difference to us. It made work less soul starving. So that's one thing. And then the second thing about curiosity and the importance of it, when we look at a lot of the examples that are quoted on OKRs and why OKRs are the key to success, Intel is often brought up, right? And it's the example of Andy Grove that he instituted OKRs at Intel in the 80s and 90s, and look how successful they were. That's what led to all of that innovation. But if you look at reality, Walter Isaacson, when he wrote about Andy Grove, when he was Man of the Year on Time magazine, what he said was it was Andy Grove's paranoid obsession with never getting complacent. That was what led to all of that innovation and changing an entire just tech industry, right? Based on all the chip revolution. The the root of that was the experimentation, the curiosity. Just Andy Grove constantly got everyone to experiment, adapt. He created in people this feeling that you have to expect unexpected change. And how are you going to adapt to that, right? He allowed for open conversation. He used to keep a cubicle, not a corner office, a cubicle that was the regular size of everyone else's, so that people could challenge his ideas as an equal. Um, so all of what I'm talking about, in terms of having these conversations, etc., it is rooted in what he used to do. It's just what we adopted from Andy Grove was OKRs as a framework. What we had been missing was a framework for how do you create that curiosity, experimentation, adaptation. And that's how it needs to, that's what we really need in organizations. Because later at Intel, Andy Grove's successors, I mean, they had OKRs. They didn't have that same level of curiosity, right? They missed out on the whole mobile chip market. They missed out on standalone GPUs and the AI revolution. They missed out on new semiconductor manufacturing processes, all because they didn't have that same level of curiosity and ask the question, how do we adapt to the market? Instead, they actually paid a competitor. They paid Dell, for example, to not use AMD chips.
Hmm. There's a whole thing around just the simple that idea of curiosity and asking questions that's so important. I mean, to what you were saying, it's hard to be complacent when someone's asking questions, right? You don't fall into that
Yes, so true.
complacency, right? And unfortunately, in most organizations, it's the leader who has to ask the questions before it becomes an important question. But often, the important questions are with the team, and do they feel safe in asking those questions? And if they ask that question, does somebody think that it's important to find the answer or to solve that problem? And sometimes it's so simple. Like, I remember in my last episode, actually, I talked about bringing a more agility to more agile practices to an organization that I was at. And what I did was I ended up having like an organization wide kind of monthly demo where everyone who's working on the transformation, because you're right, sometimes it's just in a bubble that you can create that safety. How do you bring that bubble, how do you open up that bubble to the rest of the organization, even if it's once in a while, to bring everyone along for the ride? And just that simple act of having the executives there and having those executives ask questions as though they didn't know all the answers, that can be a hard thing depending on the culture. But that really made it safe for everybody to start asking questions. And the way we treated every question was important, coming from everyone. And just those kinds of practices create such a sense of it being safe to be curious. It's safe not to know everything. Nobody expects you to know everything, and it's okay to question, which is sometimes the first step to getting to the kind of culture that you're talking about. I think.
Oh, I love that example. And you as a leader presenting this sort of a demo with questions, etc. Right? I was talking to someone and they were talking about how they were using this new approach that I talk about. I call it OHLs, by the
Hmm.
way, objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. So they were talking about how they were using this OHLs approach. And one of the things that they were doing was they were just presenting a particular initiative. And they had started working on an initiative. And then halfway through, they actually said, wait a minute, I'm not sure if this is adding so much value. Let's make this one small test on trying something different. And they realized, oh, this other thing works so much better. So what they presented was this huge insight that they had. We were trying this, it wasn't working as well. This is what we tried instead. Here's what we learned. And therefore, here's what we're going to do next. And so this whole approach was not just something that, one, they were role modeling it, right? They were role modeling this sort of safety where you can question, ask something, learn from it, and you're sharing such learnings because you realized what you were doing was wrong and you needed to do this other thing. But two, you're also creating this sort of safety for others to ask similar questions. And you're spreading this way of thinking so that others, it can be a mindset for everyone.
Amazing. How important do you think it is to tell stories behind things? I have an artist friend and he does incredible art, but even better than the art itself is the story behind, how he got to the art, how he was inspired, like the process, because he always adopts these crazy processes like using gold in a way that hasn't been used since biblical times, for example. And he like has this whole story behind it, which is really like the art itself. And it really it's a thing. And I'm just wondering, within your experience and everything that you're putting together, how important is that story and how do we create a stage, for that? Because you talk about the performance, the performance theater is, I think, the term that you used.
Yeah, I found that the storytelling is so incredibly powerful, and it's powerful for two reasons. One, it gets you to think more deeply. There's a friend of mine, his name is Gaurav Ved, and he had a stroke a few years ago. And he realized that since he had a stroke, it had affected the left side of the brain. And he had to do more storytelling, but it had changed how he was thinking about things. That he wasn't just focused on the numbers. By telling the story around it, he had sort of these deeper insights that he previously didn't really focus on because he was focusing on the numbers, right?
Mhm.
And so when I was sharing this approach of how well is it working, what have you learned, and tell me the story around what have you learned, it really resonated for him because he had experienced that sort of a shift in thinking. So that's one thing, that by actually telling the story, you understand better and you start to think differently. You start to think more creatively based on those numbers, right? Um, the second thing is it really creates more engagement. So we talked about those 45-minute meeters with
Yes.
executives where, if at all you have 45 minutes, that's a good day.
Yeah, that was a lot. I have to say that was kind of a fantasy world I was living in just now. Yes, you're right.
And so what I've found is, very often as a team, we have been delving into numbers. We want to present numbers because those are the targets. But honestly, even for leaders, it's really hard to absorb all of those numbers and understand what does it actually mean. And so when you tell the story and narrative, it really creates more engagement, even with leaders. It's much easier to share what's happening and invite their feedback, because otherwise I've seen teams spit out numbers, but you feel, as a leader, you feel like you're in a shooting range with all of these numbers. And I just don't know kind of how do I duck. That's my instinct at some point, right?
That's funny. Um, Radhika, I think we'll probably have to wrap it up. I could talk to you for days. I think I really enjoyed this conversation. It's been very colorful in a way that I didn't even expect, with the stories of whales sinking. That one's going to stay with me. But also everything we've talked about, from how you've helped organizations to rethink and prioritize and to be really creative, all the way to the goal setting and the storytelling and how it could really feel to be, in an organization that is working together to solve puzzles, and then taking action from that and having real impact. We didn't get a chance to talk about the social impact and maybe other types of transformation as well, but I'd love to have you on again to do that. Just before we wrap up, I wonder, are there any last words of guidance or anything that you would want to leave our audience with today?
Um, the one thing maybe I'll share is um, anything can be your product if it's your mechanism to create change. It's a profound thought in that, we've always thought about products as just software or a digital or a physical thing. But, software is your mechanism for creating change. And when you think about that, whether you're approaching it as transformation or anything else, it can be something where you approach it very, very systematically, because you're thinking about in this radical product thinking way of vision. What's my strategy? How do I prioritize and execute and measure, etc.? So I'll leave with that thought. And of course, if you'd like to hear more from me, you can follow me on LinkedIn. You can also find the Radical Product Thinking book. It's wherever books are sold. You can get the OHL's template, and there'll be a link I can share. And I would love to just hear from people, so that we can continue the conversation about OHLs, and you can keep an eye out for the book when it comes out about a year from now.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Radhika. Really appreciate it. And I will be following you, and I'm sure many of my listeners will be as well. And please, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe. I ask everyone to, just be part of the conversation about change. There's a lot of change going on right now and a lot that we can all learn from each other. So thank you again for joining us for another episode of Wired for Change.